why would somebody care about, if you will, AI governance? And I think the reason is because you can't get your AI projects out of the gate, if you will, unless you have sufficient governance mechanisms in place. You want to be confident. You want to have assessment of error rates. You want to have an assessment of whether or not we can use these systems in mission critical fashions. So it was a watershed insofar as it opened up the whole market, but it still poses the same problem or the same question, which is, can we have confidence in these systems? Are they trustworthy? So the problem is, it's just about, hey, we need to make sure that this is being done. And we can't think of governance as a tick box exercise. That's why the whole kind of, I understand the concerns around when people were thinking, is regulation just the way in which we just engage with counsel or lawyers and then you just get some documentation that you tick off? So what we're seeing is the business saying, okay, look, this is not about something that's taking place in one department or another department. Because if that was the case, it would probably be the business units that are motivating a lot of these kind of questions. So what we found with ethics boards is to say, okay, does it even make sense in the first place to have a kind of ethical debate about a particular system without having assessed the system?
Welcome to the Regulating AI podcast. Join host Sanjay Puri as he explores the dynamic and developing world of artificial intelligence governance. Each episode features deep dives with global leaders at the forefront of regulating AI responsibly, tackling the challenges using AI can bring about head-on and enabling balance without hindering innovation.
Welcome to the Regulating AI podcast, the podcast dedicating to shaping the future of responsible and ethical AI governance. I'm your host, Sanjay Puri, and today we are thrilled to have with us Emre Kazim, the co-CEO and co-founder of Holistic AI. Emre brings a fascinating multidisciplinary background combining expertise in chemistry, philosophy, and AI governance, and his company is at the forefront of helping enterprises implement responsible AI practices. So welcome to the Regulating AI podcast, Emre.
Thank you. Real pleasure to be here, Sanjay.
Wonderful. Emre, we have a global audience. Our audience is made up of AI policymakers around the world, civil society advocates, entrepreneurs like you, and just experts in AI. Can you just briefly tell them a little bit about your company, what does it do, and a little bit about your background?
Awesome. So just in terms of the background of the company, Holistic AI is on a mission to empower enterprises to adopt and scale AI with confidence. We have a purpose-built AI governance platform that helps companies accelerate AI transformation across the organization. So that's things like to do so transparently, responsibly, and looking to actually enhance the kind of return on investment, to actually get these kind of algorithmic systems into action, to get the rockets off the ground, if you will. By way of background, actually, I was an academic. I co-founded the company along with another academic, and we were academics together in University College London. So UCL is quite famous for, UCL Computer Science Department is very famous because Google's DeepMind spun out of our department. And then recently, actually, we just got 2 Nobel Prizes. It was Geoffrey Hinton and Demis, who are alumni or had worked in that context. So within that context, we were doing lots of research on the problem, if you will, of trustworthiness and algorithms. And within that context, that kind of foundational research really compelled us to say, this is just too important to remain as some kind of research. We've got to spin the company out and do this in the real world. So we still maintain deep roots in the academy. We still produce research industriously, but we're actually doing this at scale through the platform in the real world.
Oh, that's fantastic. It really gives some perspective to our listeners in terms of, you bring an academic and a governance background. Emre, as they say, may you live in interesting times. The past few weeks, maybe past few months, maybe past few years have been really, really interesting. And I would say even the past few days. As you know, we just had the AI Summit in Paris in France, where 2 different visions have been kind of laid out. One vision is the vision of AI, optimism. We are going to be really going all out in terms of the potential for AI, which is a U.S. perspective, as was outlined by Vice President once, that we want AI superiority. We don't want too much regulations. And on the backdrop of that was the big Stargate announcement of a $500 billion investment, especially in data centers. Right at the back of that was a 200 billion euro investment by the EU, saying we're going to also look towards making sure the EU doesn't stay behind this, but we're going to do it in maybe a more ethical, etc. manner. Now, the question I have for our listeners and for myself is, you're talking about the governance framework and governance models. How do you combine, or especially now in this US environment, if you have US clients and they're saying, hey, we're going all out, we are not really concerned about governance. So tell our listeners, why is it what you're doing is so relevant?
So, Sanjay, really, I think one of the kind of contexts of action I would say is we've been doing this. The research was actually being done in 2018, 2019, 2020. And actually, we've been doing this commercially since 2020. So we've been operating predominantly outside of a context of a significant piece of legislation being passed. So you say, okay, outside of the context of legislation, why would somebody care about, if you will, AI governance? And I think the reason is because you can't get your AI projects out of the gate, if you will, unless you have sufficient governance mechanisms in place. And you might say, why is that the case? So principally, it's the case because a enterprise wants to be able to use these systems in a way where they can prove that these systems are reliable. They can prove that there's sufficient oversight of those systems. They want to make sure that those systems don't, if you will, blow up in their face. So imagine using an algorithm or a particular kind of system in a mission critical context, and then it goes wrong. And one example of that was, and this is pretty all of this context, was there was a trading algorithm being used by a company called Knight Capital. It glitched and it wiped out $440 million from that business, and the business went bankrupt. So it's a huge amount of motivation and market forces, if you will, that motivate and ensure that a company needs governance just to be able to use these systems. So the way we see compliance is as a small part of a much broader agenda, which is, hey, as a business, we've got to adopt and scale AI, and we need to be able to do this confidently. And in order to be able to do this confidently, we need to have sufficient governance processes in place. So let me give you another example of something that really matters to a business: visibility. C-suite want to be able to know where we're using algorithms, where we're using AI, in what business units are we seeing a good return on investment? Are we seeing any return on investment in other areas? So what we have are very powerful market forces, which are to do with, can you use these systems, which are set to transform every part of the business in a way that has oversight, in a way that's accountable, in a way that we have reporting for and documentation for. And regulation is a very small part of that. So what I would really challenge is to say it goes hand in hand. We didn't have regulation that motivated cloud governance, but we had companies going through huge cloud transformation, and then they needed cloud governance. We had companies, so in a similar way to data governance, you had some parts of that which fell into regulation or regulatory frameworks like the GDPR, but actually the overwhelming majority of data governance is non-regulatory driven. So if you want to go through AI transformation, then you're going to need AI governance, and regulation is only a small part of that. So we've been operating in all the years prior to now outside of, the AI Act actually being passed and so on and so forth. And the overwhelming majority of the interest, if you will, is really about motivating AI transformation. And you can't get AI transformation without appropriate governance. And what we do with enterprises is make sure we do that in a scalable way.
So, Emre, the point is, it's not regulation, it's really governance, and governance is really needed, and we'll hopefully drill down. But another important, relevant issue happened, as I said, in the past month. This has been a crazy busy month, is that we had the release of DeepSeek, which is an open source model. Now, we've had Llama, we've had Mistral, but this was a little different. So how does DeepSeek's release, especially open source, impact what you're talking about in governance for some of the organizations, large, medium-sized organizations that are out there? Talk to our listeners a little bit about that.
So so it was quite an extraordinary event in our
Why?
ecosystem, because I think what it posed, if you will, to the broader AI ecosystem was to say, you know, it felt like the barrier for entry for a foundational model was very high. You needed a
Mhm.
lot of money. You need to get particular kinds of processes and so on and so forth. So it felt like it was a watershed, and some people have described it as a kind of Sputnik moment.
Mhm.
Now, from our perspective, as those interested in governance, so it's not so much about the kind of economic side of it, which is to say, okay, are there different models available? One of the core issues that emerged was about, if you will, can enterprises outside of the Chinese context use these systems in a way where they can be confident that they are, if they're ingesting proprietary data and so on and so forth, that can be done. So that was one aspect of it, which was more geopolitical. But we took a step back and said, okay, irrespective of those concerns, which are legitimate concerns, of course, okay, does it work as well as some of the as its competitors? So what we did is we actually ran an audit, and it was a really kind of very quick audit just to see, okay, how fragile is this system? Can we compare it against the OpenAI models and see how it performs? And what we found were like significant, let's say, security or jailbreak differences. So what we wanted to make a point there was to say there may be some economic reasons why it may make sense, but actually, even if that's the case, you still got to make sure that these systems are robust, reliable, and for an enterprise or those using these things at scale, aside from that issue of ingestion of proprietary data, you want to be confident. You want to have assessment of error rates. You want to have an assessment of whether or not we can use these systems in mission critical fashions. So it was a watershed insofar as it opened up the whole market, but it still poses the same problem or the same question, which is, can we have confidence in these systems? Are they trustworthy? And really, that's going to be the determining factor in terms of the actual use or whoever wins, if you will, in terms of this kind of AI market. It really is. Can we be confident about these things? It's very different to be using it on our desktop at home, posing some questions or asking it to pass a text, than it is to be able to use it in an enterprise context in a mission critical fashion.
So, Emre, is that true for all open source if an enterprise is using, let's say, Llama or Mistral, or are you picking just on DeepSeek? For our listeners who happen to be CIOs, CTOs, what is your message that they should just stay away from open source?
No, no, we're not saying that at all. We don't take a position on that.
Okay.
I think what we got to do is, so the way we specifically regarding language models is that
Hmm.
we have something called the safeguard, which is a module in our platform, and there
Hmm.
what we're doing is basically testing a model that they're using against open source models and in some cases proprietary models. So really, it's not about saying don't use open source. Those companies are very well placed. They have their own, if you will, kind of motivation and justification behind it. Some of it's to do with how mature their own internal teams are, how confident that they are to build on open source models and whatnot. Really, what we're saying is actually that's okay. Even with, like I said, even notwithstanding DeepSeek's the more geopolitical questions around it,
Hmm.
irrespective, let's have a look at how well these systems perform. So the argument is not against open source at all. The argument is more about make sure that you're doing this in a way where the systems that you're using have been tested and benchmarked against each other.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. Um, Emery, you talk to a lot of enterprises out there, and a lot of them are listening to you right now. Based on your experience, what are some of the biggest challenges enterprises face when they're trying to implement responsible AI practices, in your view?
I would even maybe just kind of take a step back and just
Mm-hmm.
say, what is the actual problem we're coming across
Mm-hmm.
all the time? The actual dominating theme is, and we almost kind of say this hush in a hush voice because there's just so much hype around AI, is overwhelming majority of dollars spent on AI goes nowhere.
Mm-hmm.
So, everybody's taking a bet on AI. Like we all believe that it's going to have this kind of huge transformative ability. And we're seeing this extraordinary innovation and technology in our ecosystem. But
Mhm.
are we seeing, and I'd ask that question to you as well, Sanjay, can we point to the killer use case? Can we point to where it's been successfully scaled and just totally transformed this or that part of the business? Now, there are movements towards that, absolutely. But really, the kind of core conversation we're constantly having is saying, okay, look, why are they engaging with us? Is they're saying, hey, we're taking a real bet here. And we're all and enterprises are in some kind of, it's almost like an AI race. It's like the speed for AI transformation. The winners of this transformation are going to be the winners of tomorrow.
Mhm.
And at the moment, you can't do that in a way that's just random, sporadic. There needs to be oversight. So really, there is this kind of sense in which it's saying, can we put order into this chaos? Like what the governance question is really about that kind of visibility, oversight, robustness in testing, evidencing, really being able to say, hey, this system that we want to use in this context has these kind of risks. What's the verification for that? How do we have controls and so on and so forth? So really for them, it's the conversations that are defining our conversations with them is them saying, okay, we're all part of this kind of, nobody needs to prove the value of AI, but really we're concerned about how can we do this in a way that makes sense for the enterprise, and governance is the mechanism of doing that. So in terms of responsible AI more generally, that's really about a question of higher, broader impact. What we're really concerned about is trust and responsible AI. It could be that a system is well governed, but maybe you shouldn't use it, or it doesn't cohere with your broader values. That's a different kind of question. But even to answer that question, you have to have a good, robust, trustworthy a mechanism to assess that the system is trustworthy. So that's really what we're doing with our platform.
So that leads to some very interesting points, Emre. So let me see if I can. You asked me what do some of our listeners or some
Yeah,
of my guests. I talked to a lot of chief AI officers um, in terms of their, and you asked me about some of the killer use cases. Again, I can tell you a small sample. I having talked to maybe 50, 60 chief AI officers of Fortune 500 companies on one of my other podcasts. Customer service happens to be probably the
yeah,
number one application. The other question when I ask them is they say the cost for getting left behind is much higher than putting our chips in the game. So they're
yeah.
ready to put the chips in the game, but what they're saying is if we get left behind, the consequences are much, much more serious for that. In terms of return on investments, they say they're tangible, intangible. Um, any thoughts on that?
So it was asked recently at a panel with a large consultancy that had put this together, and they were saying, what are you hearing as the biggest risk regarding AI? And it was very much that is that you can't execute on the AI transformation. Industry is seeing that as the greatest risk. And I think just to kind of return to that point is we've seen significant investments by enterprises over the last year, especially since early 2023, all the way till now. And I think the question here is that then you've seen, so they are taking bets and they want to make this happen and they need to innovate. And I really take the point about intangible ROI as very important because, they're gaining experience by doing this. They're building teams inside, they're normalizing this kind of experimentation and use of AI. So all of this, notwithstanding any of that, it really is to say, you should think of how do you structure that innovation? Like, how do you ensure that you have visibility on that innovation? So let me take an example. I think it was Air Canada. They incorporated pretty rapidly a customer chatbot. And then the customer chatbot went AWOL, if you will. And then the consequences for the business reputationally, in terms of, and I think there may even have been some lawsuits that followed. I'm not sure about that, but certainly reputationally was very high. So the problem is, it's just about, hey, we need to make sure that this is being done. And we can't think of governance as a tick box exercise. That's why the whole kind of I understand concerns around when people were thinking, is regulation just the way in which we just engage with counsel or lawyers and then you just get some documentation that you tick off, and then think of it as something separate? No, we think of governance as part and parcel of actually getting these systems into use. So it really should be about kind of accelerating these systems rather than thinking of it in terms of as you just have some point at the end where you have to tick a box or there's just some questionnaire that you have to fill in. No, it has to be part and parcel of this. What's the point of this system? Can we measure what this system is doing? And then what can we do? When you have appropriate governance, you really have a good redress in terms of, this didn't work for this reason. Or it turns out that these kinds of systems aren't working very well, or turns out that these systems are working extremely well. So we see it as part and parcel, as a kind of mechanism, as a way in which that C-suite can get a real core view of what on earth is taking place in this program. They can't just randomly, if you will, engage in this. And it's funny because we saw from Gartner when they were publishing right at the start of the year and the end of last year, what were they put their top 10 agendas for, I think it was CIOs, and number one was agentic AI, and number two was AI governance. And that just makes complete sense.
Mm-hmm. So you touched upon this, Emre, and I saw the same Gartner report, and you're absolutely right. Governance is, and I'll come to that for a second, but what metrics should we use to measure the effectiveness of AI governance frameworks? You talked about some of it, but what, some of my listeners say, what are the metrics that, let's say, Emre, you or Holistics can offer for them to be effective?
So at the core, really at the core, the first thing that you need to assess as a CIO or as somebody who kind of is responsible for this in the business is, what is the point of the system? It's just really about looking at the use case. It's not actually, ironically, about looking at the technology first, right? If you're using a linear regression or you're using a foundational model, the risk is actually determined principally by the use case. So if you're using it to determine credit scores or you're using it to do supply chain management, that's pretty high risk. Then secondary is okay, and then we're using a this kind of technology or that kind of technology. Or if you've got a system that's just producing a word cloud for some marketing document, even if you're using a foundational model, it's not a particularly high risk system. So the first thing I would say is absolutely we need to have an understanding of the context of use, and that's really a kind of at the core a question of visibility. The second thing is to say, okay, we've got an idea that this system is being used in this context. We need to generate some kind of risk report against that. And what are the risks, the core risks that we assess for? We think our core belief is that there are a number of technical risks that need to be controlled for business risks. Those technical risks are explainability. So how is this system working? How is the system explainable? Can we have some kind of understanding of why it's producing a said recommendation and so on and so forth? Secondly, bias. Now, bias is a kind of very generic term, but sometimes bias is to do with demographic disparity. So how is the system performing against different demographics, gender, race, and so on and so forth? But sometimes it's totally irrelevant to the question of justice, if you will. It could be just bias in terms of how is it performing against a particular kind of objective end. So bias, not all in a large part to do with kind of the more equality questions of bias, but also bias in terms of just generally how is it performing on particular metrics. The third thing is privacy. So what we found is, and we've been arguing about, it's funny, some of the original foundational papers that we wrote were on the relationship between data and AI and data privacy and AI privacy. And it's really about saying, even if you've got a well-governed from a data governance perspective system, it turns out that using particular kinds of models can introduce novel risks specifically associated with AI. So the third thing is privacy. And then the fourth thing is robustness. So that's questions around reliability, reproducibility, how fragile the system is, and so on and so forth. So you can imagine there is a kind of set of, if you will, very much technical questions that are associated with the performance of an algorithm or use case. And then we say, okay, but what are they being controlled against? And it's things like reputational damage. It's things like financial damage. It's things like in terms of the operational risk, and also compliance or other kinds of frameworks. Is there a law that this should be conforming to, and so on and so forth. So really, what we're saying as a business, or as our core thesis, is to say you've got these kind of business risks, and you've got to be able to control the algorithm in its own technical verticals against those business risks. And that's a way in which you can have a robust, holistic, really kind of in-depth understanding of the system. And Sanjay, one thing I would really kind of point to the listeners is to say the reason why this can't be a tick box exercise, the reason why this cannot be an exercise in simply filling in a form, is because algorithms aren't like that. They're dynamic. They need to be invested. That they change. They're technical systems. They're social technical systems for sure. But let's not discount the technical side. We can't have a situation in which somebody simply just asks a few questions, fills in a form, and then says, okay, that's governance. No, this requires things like testing, verification, mitigation, and monitoring. And that's what we do.
So I think you made some excellent points. You said privacy, you talked about explainability, you talked about, compliance, robustness. So that leads me to several questions here, and this has come up from some of my guests, some of our listeners. And I'll just lay out before I forget some of those questions, and then you can answer them in any order. One is, what about smaller and medium-sized businesses who don't have that kind of, because you're talking about some heavy-duty lifting here, technical business. So address that, because I get asked that a lot. So that's one. Second is, at what level in these large enterprises should the board get involved in this? Is it the C-suite that gets involved in it? So when I talk to the chief AI officers, they say, hey, my role is not just managing data and ML. Today, it's managing governance. I need to understand. I'm not a lawyer, but I still need to understand that my role is strategy. My role is change management. Is change management also part of this? So that's the other question. And then finally is, you talked about privacy, the GDPR. I don't know if you've seen some of the comments recently that have been put out about the GDPR and things. In the United States, we don't have a privacy law per se. There is a talk about maybe something happening. I spoke to a member of Congress yesterday. Maybe the time might happen, etc. So just if you can just briefly address some of these questions that have come up.
I think just for me, the thing that's really screaming out as a common theme is AI transformation. And it really is. So that's change management. That's really about saying we're pivoting the whole business to being, so a phrase that we keep hearing is to be AI first. So what we're seeing is the business saying, okay, look, this is not about something that's taking place in one department or another department. Because if that was the case, it would probably be the business units that are motivating a lot of these kind of questions. But actually, it's about change management. It's about AI transformation. It's about how can we be confident that we're executing on this? How do we have visibility, and so on and so forth. So we're seeing this as a C-suite problem. That is the level of engagement that we're having. And when we engage with the C-suite, they get it. They get it, Sanjay, because it's exactly as you said, because they're looking at a more strategic, they're looking at it in a much more kind of fundamental view, rather than as a kind of, hey, there's a problem, we need a point solution. They're looking at it much more in terms of their remit is this AI transformation, and governance is the mechanism to achieve that, if you will, or the vehicle or the framework in which that's going to take place. So we're seeing exactly that. And on the broader questions about a lot of the discussions, and you said it really well. You said they're saying, well, I own governance, but I'm not a lawyer, and it's really to say, yeah, that makes sense. In the same way as what cybersecurity is, governance of particular kinds of technology, data governance, cloud governance was owned by this technical C-suite. So it was also owned by who was responsible for cloud transformation, who was responsible for data transformation. So, like I said, certainly counsel is important, and then there's certain aspects in which they're really driving it. But actually, at the core, it's a much broader problem of solving this problem of transformation across the business. So we are seeing, and I think we're seeing increasingly that, and I saw this recently with a discussion about Apple, and I think it was the UK government that asked Apple to give them access to a backdoor. And it was very interesting for me to see that outside of the context of a regulatory question, there was powerful market forces to say, hey, we built our reputation on privacy, and we're going to defend this thing, and we're willing to, if you will, litigate against a state after, in order to kind of defend that position. And I think we're going to see, I think as we see this shift in the language, as we see this shift in the concern and the understanding of how central the AI race is, if you will, we're going to see more and more market forces that motivate the governance question. And by the way, and let me make this point, I think we all would share, every member of the ecosystem would share, is to say, hey, we want to make sure, when we say we want to make sure a system is compliant, is really what we're saying is that we want to make sure that the system is safe, that it's trustworthy, that it's responsible. I mean, compliance is a mechanism of achieving a greater good, right? It's not to create a compliance market in itself. It's not to simply generate, obscure legal arguments about how this or that aspect of the law is applying to this or that aspect of a particular use case. It's about saying, hey, we want to make sure that this is safe, that we impacting people in an appropriate way. So I think we all share that mechanism. It's just a difference in perspective in terms of how do we need something as strong as regulation to mandate that people, that companies don't do certain things. And in truth, probably we do. There may be some cases where it's like, it's let's not rely on the market for very specific things, like make sure your algorithm isn't negatively targeting particular demographics and so on and so forth. But more generally about, are these things reliable? Are they reproducible? Are they safe? Are they explainable? Very powerful market motivations to ensure that takes place. That chief AI officer, that CIO officer, they need to be able to report to the market. They need to be able to report to the CEO. So this is really kind of, there's very powerful reasons to believe, if you will, that this is the case, that there are market forces that can motivate this.
So you didn't address one question, and I'll add one more about the smaller companies. And the other question I wanted to ask, since you brought it up, is when I talk to a lot of the CIOs, or in case sometimes I talk to these even CEOs, they say, hey, we've got an AI ethics committee. We've got that all taken care of. That's solved, checkbox done. I wanted your feedback on what do you think of these AI ethic committees, or in some cases they call them governance committees, etc. So just if you can address small companies and then this ethics boards, etc.
So just beginning with the small companies, we split them in our minds, and sometimes it's not even small anymore, but into vendors of AI, and then, if you will, small companies that are procuring AI or building it themselves. So with respect to the AI vendors, it's obviously they're not going to be risk managing hundreds and hundreds of systems on our platform. But what they do is, and we have many customers here, is that they say, hey, we sell AI. And there's a hell of a lot of snake oil out there, Sanjay. So they want to say, hey, can we be audited by a third party? Can you really provide a assessment of the use of our algorithm so that we can have a way in which the evidence that that our systems are trustworthy? And what we do there is that, remember, we're not assessing there the kind of the ethics of their system. We're assessing the performance of their system against particular kinds of performance metrics. And what we're doing there is providing a kind of documentation to say, these are the suites of tests that we've done, and this is how the system performed against it. So that really gives them an ability when they're going to market to say, hey, we've had a third party assess our systems. So that's specifically, let's say, AI companies themselves. Some of them are quite small, some of them are very large. And then secondly, in terms of the enterprises or the smaller companies, we do that all the time. And really for them, it's about third party risk management.
Hmm.
So they're coming in saying, hey, we're procuring these systems. And exactly the problem that we saw on the vendor side, which was, okay, when they're selling, people are saying, it does this work? Doesn't it work? I mean, how can we be confident? Do we have redress? It's coming up for we're involved very much in their third party risk management. So that's how it works with those smaller companies, and typically they're adopting algorithms in usually mission critical contexts, and then they would need a mechanism to be confident that those systems work. So that's how we do on the vendors and the smaller companies. Now, I think the second question was regarding
Ethics boards, governance boards, do they kind of how do they
so
work
so
for you?
so Sandra, I think so. We should. So the reason I smile, Sanjay, and it was funny in the introduction when you mentioned my background in chemistry and then philosophy. So I actually was I did my undergraduate, postgraduate in chemistry, and then I was actually doing a PhD. And I said, you know what? I had an existential crisis, Sanjay, and I decided to do a master's and PhD in philosophy instead.
Mhm.
And I did my PhD not in the philosophy of science or technology. I did it in ethics, and I
Mm.
did it in a very obscure. I did it in a German philosopher called Kant. So I'm going to plug the book that I wrote, which I think in the whole world, maybe no more than 4 or 5 people, including my mum, have actually read it. It was a book on conscience. So, I had this kind of background in ethics and really kind of deep foundational ethics. Kant was a very important philosopher in the Enlightenment and modern thoughts about autonomy and rights. And then, actually, by accident, I ended up writing on how new digital technologies were forcing us to renegotiate the social contract. So I got into this background with a background in ethics. It was really kind of interesting motivation. And I think what we found, which is a little bit counterintuitive, is to say, ethics is a term which is a very subjective term. Different people have different subjective understanding of the word ethics. And what we found was that a way in which to kind of and that sometimes that even goes into political positions and so on and so forth. Now, what I understood through the work, through the company, through what we're doing as a company ourselves, is to say what we're interested in is risk managing or governing a system in a systematic and scalable way that says, hey, here's how we've assessed the system, here's how that system has performed against it, and then what this provides you is the necessary but insufficient conditions within which someone can assess the broader impact and the ethics of those systems. So what we found with ethics boards is to say, okay, does it even make sense in the first place to have a kind of ethical debate about a particular system without having assessed the system? Like one has to have interrogated the system before you can even discuss, if you will, the ethics of these things. So one of the examples would be if you're using a system to determine candidates' appropriateness for a job.
Mhm.
If that system is going AWOL, where it's just totally unreliable, then it doesn't even make sense to say, is it biased to one demographic to another? It just doesn't perform, you know?
Mhm.
So what we found was really the language moved away from ethics to more things like auditing, risk management, governance. Now, in those companies that still have ethics boards, my challenge to them would be just to say, what are you judging?
Mhm.
What are these companies actually judging? And is that a way in which you can do this at scale? And is it defendable, given the fact that there is a legitimate polarity of opinions on
Mhm.
people on different systems? So my question is really about, I don't see it as competitive to what we do, but rather, what is the nature of the scope of those kinds of committees, if you will? And also, Sanjay, and I'll put this out to anybody, this is a kind of pet peeve of mine, is, genuine question, almost rhetorical one. What qualifies one to be an ethicist? Sanjay, I'm not your priest.
I know. That's a very tough question because I've had a lot of ethicists come on our show. Um, uh, anyway, I'm not going to say anything because we've had some great folks who come in on that show.
Yeah,
But excellent points. And for our listeners, please do look up Emre's book, which he has written very, very significantly. Emre, there is I would say, an existential debate that's going on. And I want just very briefly, and I'll add something to it, is the discussion between innovation and governance.
Yeah,
Currently, that's at least in the United States, just a couple of days ago, you are based in the UK. They changed their name of their safety institute now to a security institute.
yeah.
What are the implications? Because you're right in the middle of this whole thing. You're in the crosshairs of this thing because you are more on governance side while the world seems to be shifting more on the innovation side.
Yeah, I mean, I just don't see. This is the reason why I really challenge the tension there, because I just don't think you can do innovation for without governance. So one way in which a company that we work with was communicate a large enterprise we are working with was communicating internally was to say holistic AI is provides the guardrails for AI innovation. It's just I really challenge the view that I mean I asked all we just to throw back the question to any of the audience to say, you know, are you really suggesting, or is one really suggesting that you just randomly allocate capital, you just run a whole bunch of, you spend hundreds of millions of dollars in a context where you don't have oversight? I just don't think you can do innovation without a framework in place, that without a governance in place. I think it really is, if you reduce to an ethics board, if you reduce it to compliance, if you reduce it to simply a tick box exercise, then it's just something negative or something that just needs to be ticked off or get out of the way. Then you can say the way in which you would respond to that might be, actually, let's get rid of the ethics board, or let's get rid of the tick box. If it is that kind of barrier to innovation. But I just simply don't. I challenge the view, if you will, that that is a tension that's a necessary tension. I think it's the opposite. I think governance is an enabler of AI adoption at scale, and I really think that that's why we're seeing over and over that a lot of money is being spent. It's not going anywhere. We're not seeing this huge transformation. Then we're seeing some companies at the forefront that then go ahead and deploy the system. So really famous example is when Bard was released, now branded as Gemini, and then you saw it was
Mhm,
producing images and
mhm,
answers that were like either wrong, or they were just like, they were just contextually inappropriate.
mhm.
Um, you know, so it's just coming across over and over. That there you go, the whole thing kind of blew up in their face, if you will, because the appropriate governance wasn't in place. So I fundamentally believe that if we're going to be able to, if you're going to do this at pace, if you're going to drive a car in a very drive a car to its maximum ability, you've got to have very, very good brakes and controls and a good seatbelt on. Otherwise, it's inevitably going to be tragic.
So you're saying you need good governance for effective innovation.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I am now, as I said, tempted to ask you one last final question. I mean, there are a zillion questions I have for you, but
Yeah.
this one would be absolutely last before we go into our lightning round. So you gave an example of a car just now.
Yeah.
So, and we'll take, if there is a problem, if the car has an accident, uh, in this case, who is liable here? The manufacturer of the car, the driver of the car, or if the person they hit was also at a mistake here? And the same thing applies if the AI does something, whether you call it bias, whether you call it some uh, a hallucination that causes serious harm. Is the foundation model company liable? Is it the implementer? Is it the user? Where is the liability in your view?
I think it's a fantastic question, and you divided it in exactly in the way in which we think about it. You've got the providers,
Mm-hmm.
you've got the if you will, the procurer, the
Mm-hmm.
enterprise, and then you've got like the day-to-day user.
Mm-hmm.
Now, each one of them has liability, right? You can think of a context in which the provider is making a series of claims about their system,
Mm-hmm.
and saying, "Hey, this is what this does," and then it simply just doesn't do that. So therefore, they are liable, if you will. The second one is the procurers saying, have you put the controls in place? So if you can imagine a situation in which we procure the system, and then it doesn't mean everybody in the company can use it. Is it that somebody can use it without training? Is it being able to use in a dual purpose fashion? So there's a whole host of, if you will, accountability mechanisms or procedures or conditions that would have to be met. And then if they were broken, if you will, then the person using it is liable rather than, if you will, the enterprise in the instance. And then there may be a circumstance in which very well kind of governed and it's a model provider, the enterprise, and then somebody in the company just uses it outside of the remit within which they've been trained to do so and told to do so, and so on and so forth. So I think there's liability across the kind of value chain, across the kind of different stakeholders, and I think it's really important for us to understand for individuals, companies, providers to take the appropriate responsibility for what they are responsible for, right? Because it makes sense, right? If you're going to put a model out there and it hasn't been sufficiently tested and you haven't got documentation around it, then that's your problem. That really is your fault. But then if you've done that and then someone's gone and used it inappropriately, then they should be to blame. So I don't think it's a simple question about allocating liability to a particular part of that equation, but actually saying every single one of them has conditions that have to be met. And then there may be circumstances where everything's being done appropriately and something's gone wrong. And then what I see that is those kind of incidences are just going to add to our repository of incidences that we can control for. But it has to be at the forefront of this. We're not here to act in. These are very powerful technologies. Everybody should be conscious of their responsibilities.
So there could be potential liabilities across the board.
Yeah.
People need to be conscious, and could be huge opportunity for lawyers across the board.
Well, Sanjay, here's a question: is also okay. Then let's push it back onto myself as a provider of governance. That's why I was challenging the question about ethics and saying, am I going to say, hey, this is moral or not moral? But we might have said, hey, we think this is well governed according to this. So if a lawyer has gone ahead and ticked something off, without having really understood what's taking place, is the lawyer liable? So really everybody is responsible here, at their own, in terms of their own capacities. And we need to be honest about this, that when we're saying that we're doing these kinds of tests, we've assessed in these kinds of way. That's why I'm so keen to that this should be done in a very systematic and scalable and transparent fashion. Because there's going to be changes in the methodology of testing. There's going to be an evolution. Like I said, there's going to be a bunch of incidences that nobody anticipated. And then that's going to become normalized as a kind of risk that we should control for. So we feel that we're part of an ecosystem that's evolving. Just like, we have these events in cybersecurity, and then all of a sudden we need to change a whole bunch of stuff. But we've got to make sure we're not just driven by incidences, that we're proactively trying to control for risk.
So, Emre, if you, as you said, you give your stamp of approval of good housekeeping to a company, and later the company finds out that there is an issue, are you liable then?
So the argument we would make is just to say, what have we ticked off? What are we doing here? Our whole thing is to say, look, we've ran these tests, we've controlled in these kinds of ways. So if that information is accurate, that's what we are, if you will, like the accuracy of our, did we run those tests? Did we ask those questions? That's really where we are responsible.
Well, that's very helpful to know. As I said, I have a zillion questions I could go on, but you've got things to do. So I'm going to just quickly do a very lightning round of questions. Yes, no answers. We'll just do a few of them because this has been really fascinating for me. So one-word answers, yes and no. So Emre, should AI auditing be mandatory for high-risk AI systems?
It's not. It's an absolutely.
Okay. Is the EU AI Act's current framework sufficient for governing LLMs? Yes.
You said
no?
one-word answers.
Yes, no.
Not yet. Sorry, Sanjay, not
Okay.
yet.
Okay. Do current bias detection methods adequately address AI fairness issues?
Evolving.
Evolving. And then is real-time bias monitoring necessary for AI systems?
Sometimes.
Okay. And then finally, is self-regulation enough for AI companies developing foundation models?
Yes or no? How do you do this to me, Sanjay? I mean, it's just probably not in totality, you know.
Okay. Well, thank you, Emre, for joining us really on the Regulating AI podcast. Your insights from both academic and the practical implementation of AI governance have really given at least me, and I'm sure our listeners, a valuable perspective on the challenges and the opportunities. I think, your work on holistic AI demonstrates how companies can still successfully navigate the complex landscape of AI regulation while maintaining innovation, as you rightly said. So, to our listeners, I think fantastic insights. Please remember to subscribe to the Regulating AI podcast for more fascinating discussions with leaders like Emre and who are shaping the future of AI governance. And thank you, Emre. Fantastic conversation. Learned a lot. Really appreciate
No,
it.
a real pleasure, and it's just fantastic to talk to someone else that's passionate about this whole area. So we're right at the beginning of this journey. Thank you.